From personal triumphs to defeat, career achievements and milestones, everyone has a story to tell. A little over a year ago here at Village Media, we wanted to launch a news show for our audience. We thought, wouldn't it be great if we could give our readers a peek behind the curtain into the lives of some of Canada's most prominent individuals, from athletes to politicians, and from newsmakers to those who report the news. This is Up Close and Personal. Welcome to Up Close and Personal, a year in review. I'm Scott Sexsmith. This past year, we spent some time with some very well-known Canadians, getting to know them on a personal level, beyond what we knew from their TV show, stage, arena, or anchor desk. It was a chance for us to really get, well, up close and personal. Now, the show that you see today is a big departure from how it all started. In fact, it wasn't even called Up Close and Personal. It was more of a live webinar at a scheduled day and time with you, our readers, and a featured guest. Combined with trying to do this, though, in the middle of a pandemic made for tricky logistics and sometimes less than stellar quality. Now, if you're a fan of DIY and HGTV, then our very first guest was very well known to you. Brian Baumler has been hosting shows on that network for well over a decade. 4 years ago, he and his wife Sarah had an idea to buy a rundown resort in South Andros in the Bahamas, fix it up, and turn it into what would be a #1 show for HGTV in both Canada and the United States. Island of Brian. Okay, so let's go back a couple of years to when you and Sarah purchased a defunct rundown resort in South Andros in the Bahamas. Was something like that always on your radar, to do something of that magnitude on that scale?
Never. We were actually on vacation. We loved taking the kids down to the Florida Keys. We would rent a house down there, and that turned into buying a property and then buying a bigger boat that we could poke into the Bahamas, and that turned into a couple of trips. And going through, we were in Bimini on our way to Chub Key, which is just north of Nassau, on the boat, and looking on the charts, you see this massive island. Andros Island is bigger than the other 700 islands combined. So the Bahamas is over 700 islands, and Andros is this big island, and it's the least developed and least inhabited, but it has all this natural preserve. It's on the tongue of the ocean, blue holes, you name it. And I couldn't believe that there was nothing there. So we were doing more and more research on this island, and we wanted to visit it in the boat. But it was a bit far and the weather was rough and we were trapped in a harbor. So we chartered a little airplane and flew over for the day and said, we'll fly the 20 minutes and have a look around. And we got a tour of the island, and we knew there was an old hotel for sale with some history. And we pulled into it. And I think within 5 minutes, Sarah and I kind of looked at each other, and we both had this crazy look in our eye that said, like, we should buy this. And I kind of looked at her like, you're crazy. And she looked at me like, you're crazy. And I said, I dare you, and she said, I dare you. And we threw an offer in, and that was it. And I think it was at that point we're like, okay, what do we do now? And I mean, we acquired the property itself for less than a piece of property that we did in Florida. So the thought was, maybe we'll fix up a couple of villas, and family can stay here, we can visit. And we were actually greenlit to start a new show in the Florida Keys with another House of Brian. And we changed our mind. I said, you know what, let's open this place. Let's build this. Let's turn it into a hotel. We had friends that owned a small resort hotel in the BVI who had agreed to come and help us and general manage the place. And I called the network and I said, we're not doing House of Brian. We bought a hotel. And they said, well, you're crazy. We can't. I mean, the logistics of this are nuts. And I said, imagine the logistics of renovating this place. But, who doesn't want to just throw their life into the air and head to an island and do this kind of thing? We thought it would be interesting. And the network finally begrudgingly agreed. And we loaded the kids up and we headed down, thinking we'd be there about a year. And it's 3 years and 1 month to the day since we arrived on that island.
From the warmth of a beach in the Bahamas to the chill of a curling rink, we spoke with Brad Jacobs, skip of the gold medal winning curling team at the 2014 Olympics in Sochi. We talked to Brad about the moments leading up to the gold medal game and how he slept the night before the match. And his answer was very surprising. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit. You finished at 7-2, and then moving on to face China in the semis. You win that game 10-6, and then advance to the gold medal game. How much did you sleep the night before?
slept like a baby.
Really?
Actually, yeah. And it's like, well, why? We shouldn't have, right? We had a really good Curling Canada. After we won the Olympic trials, they put together a little weekend session for us at the Glencoe Club in Calgary, and they brought Mark Tewksbury in to speak to us and give us some motivation and also tell us about what the Olympic experience is going to be like. And Mark was fantastic, as he always is. And one of the things I took from that speech and everything that he gave us was he talked about sleep. He talked about rest, and he talked about how he struggled with rest and sleep during the Olympics. I think it was in '92 when he did really well. But he said that, sleep, as long as if you can't sleep, it's okay. Just make sure when you go to bed at night, if you can't sleep, just lay there, let your body relax and just stay in bed. And just doing that, you don't necessarily need to get a whole lot of hours of sleep to be able to come out the next day and perform. Just let your body relax and you'll be fine.
Great advice from Mark Tewksbury. And again, our sincere congratulations to Brad and the rest of the team on their gold medal victory. His journalism career spanned over 6 decades, and to this day still holds the record as the longest-serving national news anchor in television history. Of course, referring to the incomparable Lloyd Robertson. It was a pleasure to spend time with the Stratford native who became such a part of our daily lives for so many years. During our chat, Lloyd recounted some of the most significant events that he's covered over his career. Through your career, you have covered or reported on some of the biggest events of our time. Expo 67, the moon landing, the Quebec referendums, countless federal elections, royal weddings and funerals, of course, most recently that of the Duke of Edinburgh, and of course the attacks on 9/11. You've always said that you've had a front row seat to history. Is there one or two things that stand out to you as being significant that you got to witness firsthand?
Well, I think two things, because they're kind of at the bookends of my career. One was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And the other one was 9/11 in September 2001. And those two shattered people's perceptions of what was going on in the world, because we never thought that we'd see live on TV, almost live on TV, the assassination of a president. And on 9/11, a total shock. Out of the blue came those planes hitting the towers. And both had a considerable effect in kind of moving public consciousness right after those two events. In 1963, it was a matter of the rest of the world realizing that the presidency was now this vulnerable. There had been assassinations before, but never one that was so public, never one that had the kind of international response that the Kennedy assassination had. I mean, even the president of the old Soviet Union at the time commented on the fact that he liked John Kennedy. This was felt around the world, everywhere, and for a long time after that, there were things that indicated that he sacrificed in many ways his life in order for things to move forward on the American scene. Like that's after his death, all the civil rights legislation was passed in the United States. In 64, 65, Martin Luther King, who was assassinated later. But all of that happened in the window of that period. At 9/11, it was entirely different, but a mass reaction around the world at the same time, because we had then all the security checkpoints set up at airports, all of the security systems that we have in place now, many of them originated right after 9/11. So these were two events that changed society.
As we prepared for our interview with Lloyd, there were so many things to cover, but the one question I really wanted to ask surrounded his signature sign-off. Lloyd, news anchors typically have a signature sign-off. Walter Cronkite, who anchored the CBS Evening News for almost 2 decades, would sign off with, "And that's the way it is." Here in Canada, our days always ended with yours, "And that's the kind of day it's been." Where did that come from?
Well, it came up late in the 90s when I decided I would try it just, for a little while to see how it worked. And it caught on. people began to say it back to me when I was on the street. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's getting a little much. So I stopped doing it in the year 2000, at the turn of the century. And the next day, the chief news editor walked to me and said, Lloyd, please put the sign-off back on. I've had all kinds of calls and emails from people saying, what happened to, and that's the kind of day it's been. So I put it back in and continued on with it for the rest of my time on the desk.
Coming up in our next segment, Ron MacLean from Hockey Night in Canada walks us through the night that Coach's Corner abruptly ended, and just how long does Ron plan to host the iconic show. Plus, TVO's Steve Paikin opens up about his time as Chancellor at Laurentian University and why he resigned his post there. It's all straight ahead when Up Close and Personal, the Year in Review, continues after this.
Reporters, editors, and journalists who go the extra mile to get the story and get it right. Go behind the scenes with those who cover the stories that matter most to you and your community. Look for it in the Village Features section of your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Welcome back. Ron MacLean and Don Cherry were a staple in Canadian households every Saturday night during the NHL season for over 3 decades. That all changed, though, in November of 2019, when Cherry was fired 2 days after suggesting during the segment that Canadian immigrants benefit from the sacrifices of veterans but don't wear poppies. In the days that followed, this became national news, in some cases dividing the country. Some siding with Cherry, others blasting his partner Ron for throwing Cherry under the bus. We sat down with Ron MacLean, and he walked us through that incident. Okay, we talked briefly about Don Cherry, and I don't want to dwell on the Coach's Corner issue, but I would be remiss, of course, if we didn't quickly cover it. The feature came to an end after, I think, 38 seasons. How hard was that situation for you and Don to go through?
Yeah, extremely hard. I think it would be Don's answer to know if he decided it's his time. It certainly was a case of all we needed to do was apologize for the misstep and move on. And that didn't happen. So that was really hard for me. I was in the middle of doing hometown hockey in Welland on the Sunday when it was all going down. Really hard to have a face-to-face over a beer, looked on. We need to, do this to make it work. And that didn't happen. And, I was boxed into a corner where I had to kind of do the apology on the Sunday. That was always the one regret I had, is that, to sit home as Don would have and watch me apologize on our behalf. I've had to apologize for fellow broadcasters in the past, and I never like it. I don't think it's chivalrous. I don't think it's right to be the spokesperson for another's mistake. I had made my own by not calling Don out in the short moment that maybe I could have. But yeah, that was the one clumsy part of the day. And then after that, I think Don made a decision, and then I had to live with it. I was so comfortable with the principle of the argument, Scott, that, we had made a mistake. You cannot project an attitude on immigrants. However harmless it may have seemed, it absolutely was wrong. And to carry on was hard, because it meant I had to then say, okay, well, are you going to be the courage of your convictions and stand on the principle that you believe in and keep working? Or are you going to fall on your sword and just go away as kind of, there goes Batman and Robin. It was fun, and they'll be loved for life, even if they're recognized as having made a mistake. I couldn't live with sort of condoning that mistake. It was very important to carry on and sort of try and fight for my principles.
With the exception of 2 seasons, Ron MacLean has hosted Hockey Night in Canada since 1986. With a couple of years left on the current Rogers rights holder deal with the NHL, Ron isn't quite sure what will happen after that. I'm not sure what your contract status is, but if it were up to you, would you continue to host the show for as long as you were able to?
No, I do see succession as important. I was kind of happy when George took over. I was willing to move from the way I kind of analogize it, from the first line to the fourth line. I was still doing Coach's Corner, which was a pretty watched segment of the show, but it's all I was doing. And then I would do the hometown hockey, which I adore. I was a child of Wide World of Sports, and I could go on about that. But with Hockey Night, there's 4 years left on the Rogers deal, Scott, so it kind of stands to reason. I'm 62, just turned 62. If I could make it to the end of that deal, I would be happy with that. And but I've never been a goal setter, and I'm certainly not a clinger honor. I don't try not to be attached to, I think the big battle in life is to cope with impermanence in our health, in our careers. And, we don't deal with it that well. but I've shaped my whole life because of being an only child and being uprooted over and again. I've taught myself, or tried to teach myself, to accept change and be cool with change, and know that sometimes that change is pennies from heaven. Could actually be for the best. So if one day they come in and say, Ron, we'd like to get some young blood in the chairs, say, great.
Steve Paikin has been with TVO for over 30 years, and since 2006 has hosted The Agenda, the network's flagship current affairs program. For a period of 8 years, Paikin was also the chancellor of Laurentian University in Sudbury, until he abruptly resigned following the announcement by the university that they had filed for creditor protection. We talked with Steve about that decision and how surprised he was to learn of the situation at Laurentian.
Let's head north up the highway and talk about the ongoing insolvency situation at Laurentian University. You served as chancellor there from 2013 to April of 2021. Was your resignation, Steve, directly related to the financial crisis that was going on, or was it something else?
I've tried really hard not to answer that question for a long time because I've not wanted to be a distraction to all of what the university has to go through right now. Here's what I can say about all that, Scott. I didn't know any of that was coming down. People may not know, but there are various kinds of chancellors. There are some chancellors who, talk daily to the presidents of their institutions. They go out and do fundraising for the institution. They lobby government for the institution. That was not me. Because I'm in journalism, I was the exact opposite.
Right.
I did all the ceremonial stuff for Laurentian. I presided over convocation. I presided over big events. I never lobbied government. I never raised money for them. I just, I wasn't allowed to do that kind of stuff. So when the developments at Laurentian took place, nobody was more shocked than me. I had no sense at all that it was about to happen. I had had a conversation with the president and the board chair, 6 weeks before that announcement was made. It was all pleasantries in the meeting. There was no indication given by either one of them that anything untoward was about to happen. And so I was truly shocked when it did happen. And given everything that had happened and how out of the mix I clearly was about the whole thing, I guess I concluded there wasn't much point in hanging around, and it was too controversial at that point anyway. Remember, I'm in journalism. I think the deal with Laurentian in the first place was, as long as things stay uncontroversial, this is something we'll let you do. But once it got controversial, that was a problem.
And when it did come out, Steve, did it surprise you that it was as bad as it was?
Oh, for sure. I'd been affiliated. Remember, the current president of Laurentian was, if I can put it this way, my third president. I'd worked with two of them before that. And by all objective criteria that I had seen during my time there, things seemed quite successful. We had a goodly number of students going there. We had great philanthropic donations to the university happening while I was there. The place seemed to be well managed. Every time, I'll tell you what, when you're the chancellor and you give out degrees to thousands of people twice a year, unlike other universities, which sort of bring the students come up, they get their degrees, it's a handshake, it's a picture, and gone, they're gone. At Laurentian, what I loved about convocation was we really took our time, and each student came up. I handed them their degree. The president and I would have a little conversation with them. I'd ask them, how was your experience here? It was great focus group. I could find out how optimistic they were about their future, about the job market, about what their next moves were in life, how much they enjoyed or didn't the Laurentian experience. All of that stuff, all of those, indicators were all very positive. So yeah, I was beyond shocked.
Sometimes some of the best material from this show happens, sadly, when the cameras aren't rolling. And that was the case with one of my favorite interviews from this past year with former Premier Kathleen Wynne. It's almost like we were destined for it not to happen. We had technical issues both on her end and ours, and after 45 minutes, countless reboots, and lots of laughs, We got the wires uncrossed and sat down and had a wide-ranging discussion, one that covered everything from her first day as premier to 2018, the year she'd love to forget, and her thoughts on how Doug Ford and his government has handled navigating us through COVID-19. Wynne told me about one occasion where Ford reached out to seek advice on the situation.
Let's change gears if we can and talk about Premier Ford and how the Conservatives have navigated us through the pandemic. I'd love your analysis on that. And I understand at the start of it all, Doug Ford called you for some advice. Can you maybe tell us how that conversation went?
Yeah, that's an interesting little story. So just as the pandemic was starting, if you remember, it was sort of at the beginning of March break in March 2020. And Doug Ford was on a radio show, and he was asked about people going, or I guess the press asked him about people going on March break. And a lot of people were starting to feel anxious about traveling at that point. But he said, everybody should just go away and have a good time. He kind of waved his hand and said, everybody go and have a good time. I was then on a radio show later that same day, and I was asked by Jerry Agar on Talk 1010 in Toronto, which is, not a radio station that is, it's not a liberal radio station. It's
right.
Definitely supportive of Ford. And I was expected, I think, to go off on him and to really lambaste him. But I didn't feel that, because I knew the guy well enough to know that he was just trying to be generous and kind, and he was trying not to scare people. And so I said, I think Premier Ford was talking from the bottom of his heart. I think he was. But here's the thing. You can't do that. You can't freelance when you are the leader and you are in a situation that is as serious as this one. So he called me afterwards and he thanked me for not taking off on him, but actually understanding where he was coming from. Because he said to me, Kathleen, I was speaking from the bottom of my heart. And then he asked me for my advice. And I said, Doug, are you really asking me? And he said, yeah, I want to know. And I said, well, I think from here on in, you need to be at the podium with your Minister of Health, there with you, and you need to be reassuring people and telling them what's going on. I had the brief experience of the ice storm in 2013 in December. And I went on every day and gave people a report with the people from Toronto Hydro and Ontario Hydro, or Hydro One, and tried to tell them what was going on. So that was just a brief window on what he was dealing with. And I knew that that's what he needed to do. Now, I'm not suggesting he followed my advice, but he did do that. And I think he was probably getting that advice from a bunch of different quarters.
When up close and personal, the year in review returns. We catch up with former NHL goaltender and mental health advocate Kelly Hrudey. Also, two of Canada's most well-known news anchors who, for a time, were married to each other. And Canadian rock legend Kim Mitchell. Don't go anywhere. We're back right after this.
For the latest in in-depth features and enterprise journalism from your local writers at Village Media, be sure to check out The Big Read. The Big Read. It's the full story behind the headlines. Look for The Big Read on your favorite Village Media website across Ontario.
Peter Mansbridge and Wendy Mesley are perhaps two of the most well-known journalists in Canada. They also have a number of things in common. Both started their careers in radio. Both spent a significant part of their careers at the CBC anchoring The National, and for a period of almost 3 years called each other husband and wife. Peter and Wendy were both guests this year on Up Close, and Wendy recounted the first time she sat behind the anchor desk. Wendy, let's flip to you if we can for a second. Anchoring a national newscast is a huge responsibility. Can you describe to me the moment that became a reality and maybe the first time you sat down behind that desk and what went through your mind?
Well, the first time I did a newscast in front of a microphone was back when I was a child at CKFM, and I was terrified of the microphone. So I'd gotten over that. But then I was occasionally, 20 years later, I was filling in on The National, reading the news for the first time. And we used to be in the old building where like maggots fell from the ceiling before we moved to the new building. And what were it was Rusty and whatever, the puppets were hanging up just behind the, the puppets for not Mr. Dress Up, but
Oh, the
before
friendly
Mr. Dress Up,
giant.
whatever. The friendly
Yeah,
giant, yes.
Rusty,
So those
Rusty
puppets,
and Jerome.
Rusty and
Jerome.
Jerome. Yeah, so they were hanging up in the back of the studio, and you tried to like treat it like what you're doing was serious. So I went in to fill in one night, and it was like 1990 or something. And it was the night that the Gorbachev government, there was a mutiny, and he fell. So I did the newscast, and it was all like terrifying, but I'd been a reporter for a long, long, long time at that point. So it was okay. And I was driving home, and it's 11:30 or whatever. And I get this call saying, the Russian government has, or the Soviet Union government has fallen. You need to come back immediately. So I whipped the car around, went straight to studio. I still had makeup and hair sort of on. And Don Murray was in Moscow, and I talked to Don Murray. We had no other, and they kept like throwing wire copy at me, and that was fine. But oh my God, I was terrified. And we managed to get through it. And they kept saying, "Oh yeah, no, the script is coming. The script is coming." And it's like 10 minutes to air. It's 5 minutes to air. It's 1 minute to air, and there was no script. So it was just like, this is what happened off the top of my head because I'm such an expert on Russian politics. Not. And Don Murray is going to be with us, I hope. And then off we went, and somehow we all survived. But I still have dreams, like now, in my advanced age of trying to find the studio, and it's 1 minute to, and I'm trying to get there, and there's no script, and my hair. I don't have the naked for exam thing, but I do have the National is on in 30 seconds, and I gotta be there. So yeah, that was the first time. And then after that, it, sometimes it would get a little boring. I'd play like little games in my head of how many tracks can I have going at the same time so that I can think about what I'm reading that I've read before, because as an anchor at CBC anyway, you see everything and you're involved in everything before it actually happens, unless it's a moving story or a breaking story or an election or something huge has happened. But otherwise, you've seen the script. And so I'm reading the script, and then I start thinking about something else. And then another track is thinking, oh, well, you should stop thinking about that. And then wouldn't it be fun that maybe I could test this out and think on a fourth track? No, that would be ridiculous. Let's go back to the track. So it went from absolute terror to boredom of reading a script that was not always interesting. But the moving parts, like elections still till the very end, terrified me because there was just so much information and you had to be on the ball. So it's still good to be scared, I think, just not all the time.
Mesley's departure from the public broadcaster wasn't a memorable one. She was disciplined for her use of the N-word in an editorial meeting in 2020, which ultimately led to the retirement of the 38-year veteran. Wendy sat with us, opened up, and talked about that situation and explained that from her point of view, there was certainly more to the story.
I think I kind of got thrown under the bus a bit by my employers when a moment came along where what happened was that it was right after the murder of George Floyd by the police in the States. And I was doing a show called The Weekly, and I was on a phone call with a bunch of other producers, all of whom knew me quite well and were very supportive throughout what happened afterwards, except for one person who was brought in as a freelancer, didn't know me, and was sort of tired of all of the diversity problems at CBC. And so anyway, so what happened was we were planning a panel on what had happened to journalism, or how the racism issue was being covered in Canada by journalists. And I was so upset that somebody who was going to be on our panel, she ultimately wasn't, but I was so upset that she had told us and put out on Twitter how she was repeatedly called the N-word. And I was like outraged by this, and I wanted to talk about this. And unfortunately, on the phone call, not on the show, because this was a Thursday before the show, I used the whole word, the N-word. I used the whole word, and I hurt people. And it didn't, the phone call went silent, and I realized, oh my God, I guess I shouldn't have said that. And I apologized. And then I apologized publicly afterwards, after the CBC had said that I was being investigated and I was being taken off the show. I publicly apologized as well. But instead of it, instead of my being punished and forgiven, because I think I should have been, I never in a million years would ever call anybody that. And I never meant to hurt anybody with that. And I apologized, but I shouldn't have used the word. And so that's why I apologized. But instead of being forgiven, I was basically used to absolve the CBC of all of its sins. And it was just timing. And I believe in change. I've fought for that's what upset me, is that I'd been at CBC for almost 40 years, for 4 decades. And I'd fought really hard to fight for underdogs and be a good reporter, and I basically got tossed. So I think that was a little extreme in the end. So yeah, I wish that others had sort of taken responsibility, or not used me as the one example of alleged racism at CBC.
Wendy now co-hosts a podcast with fellow broadcaster Maureen Holloway called The Women of Ill Repute. It's a good one, and you can find it wherever you get your favorite podcasts. Peter Mansbridge anchored The National for over 29 years, winning 12 Gemini Awards in the process. Like Lloyd Robertson, who joined us earlier in the show, Peter also hails from Stratford, Ontario. In fact, splits his time between there and Scotland, where he and his wife Cynthia Dale love to spend time. A short time after we launched StratfordToday.ca, we sat down with Peter, and I asked him about the importance of local journalism to communities like Stratford. I have a segue into my next question, Peter, and it surrounds local journalism, and it's kind of what we hang our hats on here at Village Media. In fact, your hometown, we operate StratfordToday.ca, which is one of 18 local news websites that we have across the province. In your opinion, how important is local journalism, and what does it mean to communities like Stratford and others to have those kinds of outlets?
Well, keep in mind, you're talking to a guy who started in Churchill, Manitoba, right? Thousands of people on a good day. And it was the only, we didn't even have a newscast when I started. And they wanted me to play records, which I was terrible at. So I pushed to start a newscast. And it was all local, right? I mean, Churchill, you have wonderful stories like polar bears and things like that.
Right.
But most of it was covering the town council, covering the school board, covering the various issues and concerns that average people have. You know, their schools, their sewer, their water, their roads, what have you. Those are critical to any success on a community level anywhere. And if you don't have journalists asking the questions and reporting what they get as answers, you're going to have an ill-informed public. You know, I can, you know, one of my friends here in Stratford is Dan Matheson. He's the local mayor, has been for like 20 years. He's not running this time around, which is unfortunate for Stratford. But nevertheless, you know, I asked him one day, when this was a couple of years ago, when there was kind of a shakeup in the local media structure and the amount of local reporting that was going on. I said, how's that impacting town? He says, you know, council meetings every, whatever it is, Tuesday night, and there are no journalists there. And what that has led to is that there are no citizens there.
Right.
People aren't informed, and therefore they're not asking questions, or they don't know where to go to ask questions. And that's not good. That's not good for community. It's not good for democracy. It's obviously not good for, you know, journalism. So how important is local? It means everything. You know, I get consumed by talking about things that happen on Parliament Hill. Well, you know, they're important, but they're not as important to my neighbor as the street outside the door, or the sewer, the water, the local taxes, the schools that his kids go to. That's what's important. And you get that through local coverage. So, you know, I applaud operations like yours that ensure that local coverage is still there.
From calling flights at an airport in Churchill, Manitoba, to becoming one of the nation's most credible journalists. If you're a Peter Mansbridge fan, check out his daily show on Sirius XM called The Bridge. He certainly is a true legend. Another legend we spent some time with this year was Canadian rock icon Kim Mitchell. From his days with Max Webster to 50 years later still touring and playing all of his hits, the 70-year-old shows no signs of slowing down. If you ever get the chance to meet Kim or talk to him, don't make the same mistake I did and ask what we can expect at one of his shows.
It's always a weird question of what can we expect. I don't ask that question usually, or nor did I in radio. And I'm saying that's okay. It's just, you know, if U2 is going to do a show, the last thing I want to know is what can I expect? You know, I want to go and I've paid my money to, oh, wow. Oh, I don't want to go. Oh, yeah. Well, apparently they're starting off with this record and then they're going into this. And then, then there's a laser show. And then there's a, you know, that's all. It's just a good band. We're a Canadian band. The production is just, it is what it is. And, you know, I'm not on Brian's, you know, that sort of international level. So we just get up there and try and connect as a band and transmit that beautiful musical energy into an audience.
And I guess in hindsight, it's one of those stock dumb questions that interviewers ask people, what can we expect? Here's what you can.
Scott, I'm not calling you dumb.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here thinking about it. And it's like, you know what? He's absolutely right. Here's what you can expect. We're going to get on stage. We're going to sing. We're going to entertain. Then we're going to leave the stage.
I know. So there's a couple of those over the years because I've done a million interviews, and when I got into radio, I'm not asking those questions. And one of them was, so what can we expect from the show? Because I think that's I think it was normally asked by the intern who doesn't know anything about you, who's like, hey, we got to do something for the promoter. Go interview that guy, Kim Mitchell. He's like, oh, so what can we expect from the show? He doesn't really know anything about you. And the other one is, so who are your influences?
Yeah.
It's like, well, you know, your audience knows who your influences are. It's if you're wearing a hat and you're playing the blues on a Stratocaster, chances are you listen to Stevie Ray Vaughan at some point, or you know what I mean? It's like, anyway, I went for other questions like, okay, man, who's always late in your band? 10 minutes before you go on stage, what's going on? What's on your catering table after the show? Just like goofy stuff like that. You know?
But that's the good stuff. And just for the record, I wasn't going to ask you who influenced you. Just to be clear.
Okay.
I guarantee one dumb question in interview, and apparently I already logged
No, Scott, please.
I'm just kidding.
And I really don't mean to just sort of go, as a music fan, do I really want to know what I'm going to expect? No, I don't really.
Our final guest of the year was former NHL goalie and current analyst for Hockey Night in Canada, Kelly Hrudey. Kelly played 15 years in the NHL for New York, Los Angeles, and San Jose. In 1993, he was so close to winning a Stanley Cup until everything came crashing down in Game 2 of the finals against the Montreal Canadiens. Go on to the Game 7 win at Maple Leaf Gardens, like you alluded to, advancing to the final against the Canadiens. And late in Game 2, up 2-1, you talk about, you get a break here, you don't get a break there. Marty McSorley gets called for an illegal stick. Can you walk us through that situation?
Sure. So we're up 2-1, and I think all athletes have experienced this. Well, I know they have. In particular, in a team game like this, where we had won Game 1, we're up 2-1 late in the Game 2, and to a certain degree, I think all of us could sense that Montreal knew they were in a tough place. And you look at a player's eyes, and they kind of tell you where they might be mentally. And so I really thought that we were in favor in that department. Now, when the whistle was blown, and Jacques Demers asked Kerry Fraser to come over, and I didn't know what the conversation was, but I clued in rather quickly, and it was going to be a measurement of a stick. And I thought, fantastic, because I don't know if you're aware of this, Scott, but for ballpark 2 periods of every game, I used an illegal stick.
Yes.
And at some point, usually going into the third, I'd change to a legal stick, maybe halfway through the second if my spidey senses told me something was up. But so, and I would try and bait the other teams. I'd leave the illegal goalie sticks after the morning skate in the garbage pail, or leave them on the bench or something, wishing that some trainer may pick up my stick and go to the head coach. Look, Rudy's using an illegal stick. Yet I used a felt marker, and I put a little mark on my stick where only I knew, and that would indicate that it's a legal stick. All right. So now we're about 2 minutes left in the third period, and Kerry Fraser starts to make his way towards our end. And clearly I am thinking, yes, He's coming to take my stick for a measurement. And of course, it's legal. And so they'll be called for a penalty, and we'll get a power play with 2 minutes to go in the third. To my surprise, he went directly to Marty McSorley, and we know the story there. It was illegal. That led to the goal by Eric Desjardins. And then, of course, Desjardins scored a hat trick early in the overtime, a minute in or something. And I knew we were in trouble in the intermission because, that was not a good dressing room to be in at that point. There was a lot of arguing, discussions, fighting, all this stuff. And I knew we'd be pretty darn lucky to get out of that overtime unscathed. Now, I'm on record as saying this. I do believe that was the reason we lost game 2, the illegal stick, but that's not the reason we lost the series. We lost the series because we lost 3 consecutive games in overtime. And if you do that, you're not going to have much success, or you probably wouldn't.
Kelly is now a mainstay on Hockey Night in Canada every Saturday night, while still providing analysis of Calgary Flames games. I think Kelly's finest work, though, wasn't in the NHL or with Hockey Night. It's the mental health advocacy work he does with his daughter, Caitlin. Both Kelly and Caitlin suffer from mental health issues and have been leading the charge to raise awareness through the More Good Days initiative. They design and sell a line of clothing wear and donate proceeds to various charities to improve mental health awareness. Check it out at moregooddaysclothing.com. And that brings us to the end of our year in review here on Up Close and Personal. We hope you've enjoyed watching as much as we've enjoyed putting these shows together for you. As the holiday season approaches, here's hoping, however you celebrate, that it's with the ones closest to you and filled with joy and happiness. Up Close and Personal returns in January with more exciting guests with even more stories to tell. On behalf of our entire team, including executive producer Derek Turner, I'm Scott Sexsmith. Thanks for watching.